What if a child's gender was treated as a milestone rather than an assumption? What if all children, regardless of their assigned sex at birth, were free to explore their identity, their expression, their interests? Gender creative parenting is a step towards that world. Today, I'm going to talk to you about what it is, how it works, and what the research says. Also known as gender neutral parenting, gender creative parenting is a parenting philosophy that embraces a child's identity, expression, and interests regardless of their assigned sex at birth. There are two key aspects to this approach. The first is encouraging freedom of expression, so providing, say, a variety of clothing, toys, activities. And the second is restricting the gendering of your child. So this can mean things like using gender-neutral language, like child instead of son or daughter. You might not make an announcement of your child's assigned sex at birth. And you might even use they, them pronouns from birth until your child can tell you their own preferences on that matter. These strategies can also work as a spectrum, and you can always just adapt it to whatever way works best for you. So say you use they, them pronouns mainly for your child, but you use he or she if you're in an unsafe environment where you don't want to be targeted. Maybe you do decide to publicly gender your child and raise them as a boy or a girl, but you make sure that they have opportunities to learn that they could identify otherwise and to explore interests regardless of their gender. Now, I want to be clear that children being raised with this method are not being raised to be gender neutral or trans or non-binary. The whole point of the method is to attune to your child and let them be exactly who they are. It means providing all options from the start and encouraging your child to develop their sense of self at an age-appropriate pace. Now, when it comes to the history of gender creative parenting, I actually find it more interesting to start with the history of gendered parenting. Because while the two-gender system that we know might feel like it's been around forever, it's actually very contemporary. There are examples of cultures around the world throughout history and in the present day who recognize and celebrate more than two genders. And even in two-gender cultures, the definition of a normal boy or girl has changed drastically over time. For instance, in the Western world, as recently as the 20th century, it was considered normal for all children, boys and girls, to wear dresses. This famous photo, for instance, shows future President Roosevelt wearing a very gender-neutral outfit for the time. There were other stylistic indicators to show the child's gender. For instance, this dress from the 1900s is obviously pink for a boy, right? Because at the time, pink was a boy's color because it was connected to red, which was considered masculine. The idea that boys like blue and girls like pink is something that was invented by mass clothing manufacturers in the 1940s and 50s, but now is accepted as total truth. And it's considered very controversial to dress your little boy in pink. All of this is to say that what is normal is actually always a trend, and trends always are changing. Now, the movement towards intentional gender creative parenting really took off in the 1970s and 1980s and was connected to second wave feminism and this idea that women could and should have access to doing anything that men could do. There's a piece of feminist fiction from 1978 called X, A Fabulous Child's Story, that sort of explores this idea of children being raised without gender. In the last few decades have shown increasing interest in this method. A very well-known example is Baby Storm from Toronto, whose story gained international attention. Storm's parents already had two older children and opted with their third to use they, them pronouns from birth and not announce their assigned sex, not even to extended relatives. They were written up in the local paper, and the article gained over 35,000 comments within just a few days, with multiple opinion pieces and TV interviews to follow up. And there were a lot of opinions. Some were supportive, but many others were concerned or felt this was a push for political ideology on a child, and many expressed concern about future bullying. Now, ironically, the people who were making a lot of these comments are also the exact same ones who would bully a child like that, in my experience. But I digress. Another example was Baby Gray, who was being raised by a couple in the Bronx, who was featured in the short film Raising Baby Gray, a gender-neutral child, which came out around 2020. And Dr. Keel Myers has discussed their journey into gender-creative parenting in their book, Raising Them, also released around 2020. Now, from a scientific perspective, the Canadian Society of Pediatricians has stated that gender identity really starts to develop around ages 2 to 3. By around 2 years old, many children identify differences between boys and girls. And around age 3, many children are able to identify themselves in terms of their gender. Around ages 3 to 5, a child's gender identity may stay stable or it may fluctuate as they explore how they feel about themselves and understand themselves in relation to the world around them. Children around this age become more and more aware of gendered expectations and stereotypes. And while some may have a strong sense of their gender identity at this time, it can still change later in life. By ages 6 to 7, most children are feeling more confident and stable in their gender identity, and children whose gender identity is different than their assigned sex at birth are starting to become aware of that too and can develop social anxiety if this is not addressed. By ages 8 and up, most children have a pretty good sense of their own gender and their relationship to their peers in that way, and they may continue to develop their identity and expression as they go into preteenhood, when puberty begins to occur, and feelings about one's gender identity, if it's at odds with one's assigned sex, may become more pronounced and uncomfortable at that time. Personally, I see gender creative parenting a lot like starting solid foods. You don't start a baby on solid food at the day they're born because they're not developmentally ready. And you wait until they're about 6 months old. You look for signs of readiness, like sitting up, interest in food, etc. And then you do a little bit at a time and try to introduce them to a wide variety of things, check for any allergies, and it becomes a lifelong relationship with food that you can nurture. I approach gender the same way because we know gender doesn't develop at the day you're born, but instead it's something that happens over several years, starting as early as 2, but really as a lifelong thing. Why are we assuming that your child's assigned sex at birth is going to dictate like their entire life? It just doesn't make sense to me. And I would much rather introduce gender at an age appropriate pace that empowers the child to explore it for themselves and figure out what actually works for them. And watch out, I guess, for any gender allergies. Now, we knew we wanted to do gender creative parenting even before we started trying for a baby. It was something that we all talked about well in advance. And the way that we approached it were things like we painted the nursery green and had a forest theme. We didn't announce the assigned sex, and we used they, them pronouns from birth for our child. However, this doesn't mean we acted like our child's sex was non-existent or irrelevant. We taught them the appropriate names for their bodies, other people's bodies. We made sure they had lots of age-appropriate media talking about things like gender identity, self-expression, pronouns. We also made sure to teach our child to use gender neutral language for other people, saying things like, who's that child over there? I wonder where their parent might be, instead of just sort of defaulting. And these things were really important to us as a family because each of us really has sort of a more complicated relationship to gender and gender norms, and we just wanted to empower our child to really be all they can be. Since that point, our child has actually developed a very strong sense of themselves and been able to express their preferences around a bunch of this stuff, but we actually still do not gender them publicly, like on social media, because it's their private business. And it's also something that's still very much in development. As part of all this, we also connected with a bunch of other parents who were doing this method. And we organized like picnics for a few years where we'd all meet up together and get our kids together so that we could sort of, commiserate and get to know one another, build a bit of a community. And these events were very well attended. Like just in our immediate neighborhood, there were like 10 or 15 families involved, which really tells me that this is a lot more common than people might think. It's just that many people doing gender creative parenting are not broadcasting it. They're not putting it on social media. They're not talking to the news. They're just living their lives. So overall, gender creative parenting is a spectrum of strategies. And the key ones I would recommend for you, if you are interested in applying it, would be replacing gender-specific language with more inclusive terms, replacing gender-specific expectations, toys, activities with, again, a greater variety of options, trying to avoid assuming that your child will develop or behave in a particular way based on their assigned sex, providing a variety of materials that can help encourage your child's development and formation of their own identity and self-expression, encouraging your child to play with all children, encouraging your child to explore their interests without assuming that their gender is going to dictate that, being your child's advocate, particularly if they do happen to identify as trans or non-binary, and making sure that your whole family is working together to unpack how gender shapes our roles and expectations in the home. And I will be real that you will totally face lots of challenges, day-to-day social interactions, places like schools, daycares, extended relatives, and just general pushback. Like that stuff can and does happen. I'm going to do a whole nother video unpacking common questions I get about this method, common concerns that people express, and my standard response. But if you just take it one step at a time and prioritize your child's well-being and your family's well-being, this method is completely viable. And I have found it to be really enriching to see my child really come into their own authentically.